Your support keeps these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I remember the first day I met him as clearly as if it happened this morning. It was just another day in the hospital: sterile lights, the constant hum of monitors, the shuffle of nurses moving from patient to patient. I had been a nurse for years by then, and nothing surprised me anymore. You learn to carry yourself with efficiency in a hospital, to hide exhaustion behind a practiced smile, to let chaos roll off your shoulders. And then he walked in. He wasn't even doing anything remarkable, just signing off on charts, speaking with his low, focused voice to another surgeon. But something shifted in me the moment I laid eyes on him. It was a physical reaction, like my body had been rewired in an instant. My chest tightened, my stomach flipped, and when he looked at me, not long, not with any kind of special intensity, just a glance, I felt like the ground had tilted beneath my feet. I brushed it off at first. Attraction happens. We're human. I told myself it was just one of those fleeting crushes, the kind you have on a teacher, a stranger on a train, someone completely unavailable. But this was different. It didn't fade. Over the next weeks, I caught myself watching him. The way he moved through the operating room, calm, precise, almost elegant in his focus. The way his eyes narrowed slightly when he concentrated. The way his laugh, rare but warm, broke through the cold sterility of hospital walls like sunlight. And soon, it wasn't just a glance here or there. It was all the time. I thought about him walking into a room before he even arrived. I caught myself listening for his voice in the hallway. I noticed the way he carried himself differently with different people, stern with some, gentle with others, and I tried to memorize all of it. At home, I brushed it aside. I had a husband, a house, responsibilities. I told myself I was just tired, just projecting something I wanted onto this man, but then I'd go back to work and the feelings returned stronger. The strangest part was how rare this was for me. I was used to attention from men, attractive enough, confident enough. It was never unusual for someone to flirt or linger too long in conversation. But most of the time, I felt nothing in return, just politeness, sometimes irritation. With him, though, I felt everything. It was like my entire body woke up in his presence. And I hated it. Because it wasn't just a crush, it was something that rooted itself in me, deep and unrelenting. Even in those first months, I knew this wasn't going to be something I could shake off easily. I remember going home after a long shift one evening, collapsing on my bed, and admitting to myself in a whisper I'd never dare say aloud. I want him. The words terrified me because he was married, I was married, and yet the pull was undeniable, like gravity. I didn't act on it, I never would, but inside a storm had started, one I couldn't stop no matter how hard I tried. And that was just the beginning. In the beginning, I thought it would fade. Crushes always do, don't they? They flare up, burn bright for a moment, and then disappear like smoke. But this one, it only grew stronger. Every day I walked into the hospital, I felt the anticipation curl inside me. The sterile halls, the endless paperwork, the beeping monitors, all of it blurred into the background because the only thing I cared about was whether I would see him. And of course I always did. Sometimes it was brief, just a nod in the corridor. Other times it was longer in the OR where I worked directly under him. His focus was extraordinary, his movements so deliberate and confident, and I found myself memorizing the shape of his hands, the tone of his voice, the way his brow furrowed when something required precision. I would come home exhausted, but my mind wasn't on the patients I'd helped or the emergencies I'd managed. It was on him, always on him. It wasn't just attraction, it was obsession. I began to notice every detail: his cologne, faint but distinct, the way he adjusted his surgical mask before entering a room, the cadence of his laugh when he let himself relax. I carried these fragments home with me like treasures, replaying them over and over in my mind. I told myself it was harmless, that everyone has passing thoughts about someone they find attractive, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. But then the guilt would hit. I was married, he was married. We both had families, responsibilities, lives carefully built outside those hospital walls. And yet inside, my feelings for him consumed me in a way I had never experienced before. Therapy didn't help. I tried. I sat in that chair and spilled my secrets, my shame, my endless thoughts about him. My therapist listened at first, nodded, asked questions, but as the years passed, her patience thinned. I could see it in her eyes, the frustration, the silent judgment. She told me you need to redirect your energy. You're allowing yourself to dwell on something you know isn't possible. As if I didn't already know that. As if logic could sever the cord that tied me to him in my mind. I left those sessions feeling worse, convinced there was something broken inside me. And then came the fantasies. I never spoke of them to anyone, but they became my escape. In my mind, we were together, not in the hospital, not sneaking around, but in some parallel life where the world allowed it. A dinner, a walk, a night where he reached for me the way I reached for him in silence. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was unfair to my husband, who had never been anything but good to me, but desire doesn't care about fairness, and the more I tried to repress it, the more it consumed me. 10 years. 10 years of carrying this fire inside me. Not a single day went by without him in my thoughts. Some days it was just a flicker, other days it was an inferno. And slowly, I began to realize something that terrified me more than the obsession itself. This isn't going away. It wasn't a crush anymore, it wasn't even infatuation. It was something deeper, darker, something I didn't have a name for. And I knew sooner or later it was going to break me. From the outside, I looked like any ordinary woman. I had a husband, a house, a career. We went to family gatherings, paid our bills on time, made plans for vacations we sometimes took and sometimes didn't. If you asked my friends, they would have said I was steady, reliable, maybe a little tired from the long shifts, but overall content. But inside, I was living a secret life. At home, my husband would ask how my day had gone, and I would tell him about patients, about coworkers, about things that had nothing to do with what was really occupying my mind. I never mentioned the way my heart raced every time the surgeon walked into the OR. I never mentioned the way his voice lingered in my ears long after I'd left work. Instead, I smiled, cooked dinner, and pretended to be present, when in reality half of me was still back in the hospital, replaying the smallest interactions with a man I had no business longing for. It was exhausting, this split existence. I'd sit across from my husband at the dinner table, nodding as he spoke, but my thoughts would drift. I'd tuck my child into bed, kiss them goodnight, and then collapse on the couch, consumed by daydreams that had nothing to do with my real family. The guilt was constant, a gnawing ache in my chest. And yet I couldn't stop. At work, the double life took on a different shape. I was professional, efficient, competent. I never crossed a line, never lingered too long, but inside, every interaction carried weight. When he asked me to hand him an instrument, my hands trembled just slightly. When he said my name, I memorized the way it sounded on his lips. Sometimes I caught his eyes on me, fleeting, unreadable, and for a moment I'd convince myself there was something there, a spark, an unspoken recognition of what simmered between us. But then he'd turn back to his work, steady, calm, unaffected. And I'd be left burning alone. The worst part was how it seeped into the most intimate parts of my marriage. When my husband touched me, I tried to be present, but too often my mind wandered. In the dark, with eyes closed, I thought of someone else. My body responded to fantasies I couldn't speak aloud, and afterward I lay there consumed by shame. I hated myself for it. Hated the dishonesty, the betrayal, even if it was only in my mind. But the pull was stronger than guilt, it always was. For years, I told myself it was harmless because I never acted, I never confessed, I never betrayed in the physical sense. But the truth is, betrayal doesn't always need touch. Sometimes it's in the thoughts you can't control, the secrets you never share, the longing that takes root in the deepest parts of you. I was two women, the wife and mother I was expected to be, and the aching, restless self who lived for glimpses of a man I could never have. And every day, the line between those selves grew thinner. I used to think I could control it, that if I compartmentalized enough, if I smiled through dinner, focused on my family, forced myself into hobbies and therapy sessions, I could keep the obsession from bleeding into every part of my life. But there came a point when it stopped being something I carried in secret and became something that carried me. The first sign was my body. My chest always felt tight, like I was holding back tears even when nothing had happened. My stomach churned before every shift, not from dread of the work but from the anticipation of seeing him. When I didn't sleep, and I rarely slept well anymore, my thoughts circled him endlessly and my body ached with exhaustion. There were days I came home so drained from holding it all in that I collapsed onto the bed, sobbing into the pillow with no words to explain why. My husband thought it was the job, the long shifts, the trauma we see as nurses, and in a way he wasn't wrong. But the real trauma was inside me, gnawing at the edges of who I thought I was. The second sign was my mind. I couldn't escape him, he was everywhere. In the hospital, yes, that was obvious, but even at home his presence haunted me. I saw his face when I closed my eyes, heard his voice in the silence. Sometimes I thought I caught a whiff of his cologne in the grocery store and had to stop myself from looking for him. Even when I tried to focus on other things, my child's laughter, my husband's stories, the mundane tasks of daily life, he slipped in like a shadow, uninvited, unrelenting. I began to wonder if this was what madness felt like. To love someone who wasn't yours, who never could be yours, and to feel it as vividly as if he lived inside your veins. The third sign was my spirit. I stopped feeling joy in the things that used to anchor me. I hated my job, hated the exhaustion, but I couldn't bring myself to leave because leaving meant leaving him. And as unhealthy as it was, the thought of walking away from him felt like cutting off a limb. But staying was killing me too. I cried in supply closets, snapped at coworkers who didn't deserve it, laughed too loudly when he was around just to cover the shaking in my chest. And one day, after yet another shift spent orbiting around his existence, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and thought, I can't do this anymore. That thought scared me. Not just because it meant I had to make a change, but because for the first time in my life I understood how obsession could lead someone to a dark place. I thought about disappearing, about vanishing from this life that had become unbearable. The thought of self-destruction whispered to me in ways I never thought possible. I didn't act on it, I wouldn't, but the fact that it even crossed my mind was enough to shake me to my core. Because it meant this wasn't just a crush, this wasn't just infatuation. This was breaking me. And that's when I knew something had to give. I couldn't keep living in two worlds, couldn't keep pretending this was manageable. I had to make a choice, not for him, not even for my husband, but for me. And the choice was clear. I had to leave. The idea of leaving started as a whisper. A small thought I pushed away as soon as it surfaced. You could quit. At first, I laughed at it. Quit? After 10 years of nursing, 10 years of building a career in one of the hardest but most meaningful fields there is, quit just because I couldn't control my feelings, it sounded absurd. But the whisper kept returning, louder each time. And eventually, it became impossible to ignore. I started testing the thought in small doses, the way you press your tongue against a loose tooth. What would my life look like without him, without the hospital, without the daily rush of seeing him walk through the OR doors? At first, the image was unbearable, a void, cold, and endless. The absence of him felt like a death not his but mine. Who would I be without this obsession that had come to define me for a decade? But then another picture began to form. A quieter life, a life where my stomach didn't twist in knots every morning, a life where I wasn't constantly torn between guilt and desire, a life where maybe, just maybe, I could breathe again. The decision didn't come in a single moment of clarity. It came in pieces. In the exhaustion etched on my face when I looked in the mirror. In the tears I wiped away in the bathroom between shifts. In the way my daughter asked me, "Why do you look sad, Mommy?" and I had no answer that didn't feel like a lie. And most of all, in the way my husband, kind, good man that he is, looked at me with worry. He didn't know the truth, not all of it, but he knew something was wrong. I owed him more than this half-hearted presence, this fractured version of myself. The day I made the choice, I felt a strange mix of terror and relief. I walked into the hospital with resignation papers tucked in my bag, my heart hammering. Every step down those sterile corridors felt heavier than the last. I knew that once I handed them in, there would be no turning back. But I also knew it was the only way forward. I couldn't keep living in limbo, couldn't keep torturing myself with what-ifs and stolen glances. I had to burn the bridge. When I finally submitted my resignation, my hands shook so badly I could barely sign my name. It felt like ripping my own heart out. But beneath the pain, there was a sliver of something else. Freedom. Of course, the hardest part wasn't leaving the job. It was leaving him. I tried not to think about how it would feel to walk out of the OR for the last time, to never again stand across from him, to never again catch his eyes lingering on mine. But even as I tried to brace myself, I knew the day was coming. And when it came, it would undo me. I woke up that morning with a weight in my chest so heavy it was hard to breathe. It wasn't just the knowledge that I was walking away from a decade-long career. It was the knowledge that I was about to see him one last time and then never again. I dressed slowly, pulling on my scrubs like armor, but inside I was fragile glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The hospital was the same as always: bright lights, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the constant hum of life and death circling through its halls. But for me, everything was different. Every step, every glance felt like a final goodbye. Nurses hugged me in the break room, whispering their good wishes. Some even cried, telling me how much they would miss me. Other surgeons shook my hand, thanking me for my years of dedication. They threw me a small going-away party with cake and balloons, laughter and nostalgia. And I smiled, I laughed, I thanked them, but none of it mattered. Because the only thing that mattered was him. When I saw him that day, my breath caught the way it always did. He looked the same as ever, focused, calm, commanding the room without even trying. But when his eyes met mine, I thought I saw something different, something softer. He asked me if I was really leaving. His voice was even, but there was something in it, a thread of disappointment, maybe even regret. And then, as casually as if he were asking me to pass an instrument, he said the words that nearly broke me. "You could stay, you could work for me as my personal nurse." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. My chest tightened, my throat burned, every part of me wanted to say yes, to throw everything else away, my marriage, my guilt, my self-respect, just to stay near him. But I couldn't, I knew I couldn't. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I turned away, hurried out of the OR, and broke down in a place I thought no one could see me. That was it, the moment that defined everything. He had asked me to stay, maybe innocently, maybe just out of habit, maybe because he valued me professionally. But to me, it felt like a lifeline I couldn't grab, because if I did, I'd never escape this spiral. So I let it go. And as I walked out of the hospital that day, coworkers cheering, balloons still floating in the break room, all I felt was grief. Grief for him. Grief for the life I never had. Grief for the part of myself that I was leaving behind in those sterile halls. That night after the party, I lay in bed sobbing. The house was quiet, my husband asleep, my child safe in their room, and yet I felt emptier than I ever had in my life. The man I had thought about every single day for 10 years was gone from my world. And all I could do was ache. The first morning after leaving the hospital, I woke up disoriented. For 10 years, my life had been dictated by early alarms, rushed breakfasts, and the sterile walls of the OR. But that morning, there was no shift to prepare for, no scrubs to pull on, only silence. And in that silence, he filled my mind. I thought leaving would bring relief, that without seeing him every day, the obsession would weaken. But the truth was, it got worse before it got better. I kept replaying my last day over and over, torturing myself with every detail. The way his voice had sounded when he asked me to stay. The way his eyes had held mine just a second too long. The way I had burst into tears like a fool and run from the room. Did he think I was unprofessional? Did he pity me? Did he even notice the way I broke apart inside? The questions circled endlessly, and with every loop the ache grew deeper. At home, my husband tried to comfort me. He thought I was mourning the job itself, the career I had poured a decade into, and in a way I was, but that wasn't the wound that bled the most. The real loss wasn't the hospital. It was him. I couldn't tell my husband that, of course, so I smiled weakly, accepted his reassurances, and then cried alone when he wasn't looking. The days blurred. I wandered through the house aimlessly, unable to focus on anything. Chores piled up. Meals went half-prepared. My body moved through routines, but my mind stayed trapped in the OR, in that last conversation, in the 1,000 memories of a man who was no longer part of my world. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the silence deafening. The hospital had been noisy, always alive, and his presence had been woven into that noise. Without it, the quiet felt unbearable. Sometimes I thought I heard his voice in my dreams, and I woke up reaching for nothing but air. What scared me most was the darkness that began to creep in. I had fleeting thoughts I'd never had before, thoughts of disappearing, of erasing myself to escape the ache. I didn't want to die, not truly, but the pain was so sharp it made me wonder how long I could endure it. And then guilt piled on top of grief. Because while I was lost in obsession, my real life, my husband, my child, my home was waiting for me, and I was failing them. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a void, unsure if I could pull myself back. And for the first time I realized, leaving him wasn't the end of the battle, it was only the beginning. The weeks after I left the hospital were some of the longest of my life. Days stretched endlessly, empty and unstructured. For years, my schedule had been dictated by shifts, emergencies, and the rhythm of hospital life. Now there was only space where my thoughts had room to grow louder, darker, and more insistent. And every thought was about him. I tried to fill the hours. I cleaned closets that hadn't been touched in years. I cooked elaborate meals I barely ate. I scrolled mindlessly through my phone until my eyes hurt. Nothing worked. The silence of the house pressed down on me, and in that silence I heard his voice, saw his face, felt the echo of every moment we had shared in the OR. I replayed our last conversation 100 times a day. His words, "You could stay," looped in my mind like a cruel soundtrack. Did he mean it casually, professionally, or had there been something more in his tone? I'd never know, but my mind refused to stop dissecting it. The temptation to reach out was overwhelming. I knew where to find him, I knew his schedule, his office, his routines. All I had to do was send an email, a professional, polite something about a reference or a follow-up. He would respond, he always did. But I didn't. Because I knew once that door cracked open, I'd never be able to close it again. So instead, I sat on my couch staring at a blank screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, fighting myself with every ounce of strength I had. The nights were the worst. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, mind racing, body restless. And when I did drift off, the dreams came, vivid dreams of him speaking my name, of us together in ways we never could be. Waking up from those dreams felt like losing him all over again every single morning. I started drinking more than I should, just a glass of wine at first, then two, then three, anything to numb the ache, to quiet the relentless storm inside me. But the relief was temporary and the guilt only doubled. My husband noticed, of course he did. "Are you okay?" he asked one night, his voice heavy with concern. I forced a smile, just adjusting. Leaving was harder than I thought. He nodded, accepted the answer, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. He knew there was more, he just didn't know what. And I hated myself for that. For the lies, for the distance, for the way I was drifting further and further from the life I had built, all because of a man who didn't even belong to me. Weeks passed, but the emptiness didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. It felt like living with a phantom limb, something essential gone, but the ache of its presence still there, sharper than ever. And I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. Had I really freed myself, or had I only cut myself open wider? The more I tried to escape him, the deeper I seemed to fall. Days blurred together, each one a repetition of the last. Wake up aching, stumble through chores, stare at nothing, cry when no one was looking. I was alive, but I wasn't living. In every moment, every empty second, he was there. I told myself it was just grief, that if I gave it time, the wound would heal, but instead the obsession grew sharper, more consuming. I couldn't drive past the hospital without my chest tightening. Couldn't hear the words surgeon on TV without my stomach flipping. Every reminder, no matter how small, was like salt rubbed into an open wound. And in the quiet moments when I should have been resting, I found myself spiraling. My mind replayed every memory with him, magnifying details until they became unbearable. A smile, a glance, a word spoken casually. I twisted them into signs, into proof of something more, even though deep down I knew it was only me who had crossed that invisible line. The spiral didn't stop at my thoughts. It bled into my body. I stopped eating properly, meals went cold on the table as I sat staring into space. I lost weight without meaning to, my clothes hung looser, my skin looked pale. Sleep was no refuge either. When I closed my eyes I saw him, when I dreamed he was there. and when I woke, the emptiness was almost too much to bear. My family noticed. My husband tried to reach me, but I pulled away. Every touch, every attempt at closeness felt like a spotlight on the lies I carried. My child asked why I seemed sad all the time, and I forced a smile that fooled no one. I hated myself for failing them, for letting a ghost of a man consume me while the people who truly loved me were right in front of me. The guilt gnawed at me, but even guilt wasn't enough to stop the obsession. The lowest point came late one night. I sat on the bathroom floor, tears streaming, the thought crossing my mind for the first time with dangerous clarity. I can't live like this anymore. It wasn't that I wanted to die, it was that I didn't know how to keep living with this constant ache. I scared myself with that thought. I shook, I sobbed, I promised myself I would never go through with it. But the fact that it was there at all, sharp, insistent, tempting, terrified me. I realized then that I wasn't just heartbroken, I was unraveling. Something had to change. I didn't know what yet, but if I stayed in this spiral, I was going to lose more than him. I was going to lose myself. When I realized how far I had fallen, I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't keep letting this obsession dictate every waking thought, couldn't keep drowning in a sea of guilt and grief. I had to try, really try, to climb out. So I did what I always do when I'm desperate. I went back to therapy. I sat in the chair across from my therapist, eyes swollen from crying, and admitted the truth I had been circling for years. I left my job because of him, because I couldn't handle it anymore, and now I don't know how to live without him. She didn't flinch, though I half expected her to. She had heard me talk about him for years, but this was different. This was me admitting that I had let him define me, that I had made the biggest decision of my life, leaving my career, because of a man who wasn't even mine. She leaned forward, her voice steady. You did something incredibly hard. You removed yourself from the situation. That was the bravest step you could take. Now we need to rebuild you. Her words felt like a lifeline. Rebuilding wasn't glamorous. It was messy, exhausting, frustrating. I tried meditation, journaling, new routines. I forced myself to go for walks when all I wanted to do was lie in bed. I picked up old hobbies I had abandoned years ago. Some days it helped. I felt a flicker of myself returning, laughing at a silly TV show, enjoying a quiet cup of coffee, feeling present with my child. Other days it didn't. I'd fall right back into the spiral, scrolling through old photos, wondering what he was doing at that exact moment, fighting the urge to drive past the hospital just to feel close to him again. Healing wasn't linear. It was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 3 steps back. I tried to be honest with my husband, though not with the full truth. I told him I was struggling, that leaving the job had shaken me more than I expected. He was kind, supportive, patient. He cooked dinner when I couldn't, picked up chores when I let things slide, held me when the tears came without warning. And every time the guilt doubled. Because while he was there, steady and loving, I was still haunted by a man who was. Slowly, I began to understand something I had never wanted to face. This wasn't about him anymore, not really. Yes, he had been the object of my obsession, the spark that lit this fire. But the truth was, the storm lived inside me. Something in me had latched onto him as a way to cope, to escape, to feel alive. And until I confronted that part of myself, I would never be free, not from him, not from anyone. So I started digging deeper. Why had I felt so drawn to him? Why had I clung to this fantasy for 10 years? What was missing in me, in my life, that made this obsession feel like oxygen? The answers didn't come quickly, but piece by piece I began to see it. The cracks in my marriage I hadn't acknowledged, the emptiness in my own sense of self, the way I had poured everything into being needed at work and at home without ever asking what I truly wanted. He wasn't the cause, he was the symptom. And if I wanted to heal, I had to stop treating him like the disease and start treating the wounds inside me. It was terrifying, but it was also the first flicker of hope I'd felt in years. For so long, I thought the problem was him. His presence, his voice, his smile. If I could just cut him out of my life, I told myself, the obsession would die on its own. But after leaving, after sitting in therapy week after week, I started to realize the truth. The surgeon wasn't the root of my pain. He was the mirror that showed me everything I hadn't wanted to face about myself. The first thing I had to confront was my marriage. My husband is a good man, kind, reliable, loyal, the kind of man most people would be grateful to have, and I do love him in a quiet, steady way, but somewhere along the line I stopped feeling alive in that love. With the surgeon, every look, every word, every fleeting interaction felt electric. With my husband, everything felt predictable, safe, routine. And instead of addressing that emptiness, I filled it with fantasy. It was easier to pour all my longing into a man I couldn't have than to admit that the life I did have was missing something vital. The second thing I had to face was myself. Why him? Why this 10-year obsession with a man who was never mine? The answer came slowly, painfully. Because it was safe. Yes, the feelings were consuming, even destructive, but deep down I knew he was unattainable, married, professional, bound by walls I could never climb, and in that impossibility there was safety. I could project every ounce of passion, desire, and longing onto him without ever having to risk what it would mean to actually have it. He became the vessel for everything I craved, but was too afraid to demand in my real life. The third thing I had to face was the emptiness inside me. For years, I had built my life around being needed as a nurse, as a wife, as a mother. My identity was tied to service, to sacrifice, to holding everything together for everyone else. But when I stripped all that away, what was left of me? Not much, and that terrified me. The surgeon represented more than desire. He represented the version of myself I wanted to be: passionate, alive, fully awake in my own skin. It wasn't really him I wanted, it was the version of me I thought I could only find in his presence. Facing these truths wasn't liberating at first, it was devastating. Because it meant the past 10 years weren't just about love or limerence or obsession. They were about avoidance, about distraction, about choosing fantasy over the courage to demand more from myself and my real life. But little by little, the devastation began to shift into something else: resolve. Because if I could finally see the truth, maybe I could finally start to change it. And so, for the first time in a decade, I stopped asking, why can't I have him? And I started asking, what do I need to find in myself so I don't need him at all? The surgeon will always be a part of my story. 10 years is too long to erase. Too many memories, too much energy, too much of myself poured into someone who never even knew the full depth of it. But slowly, I've started to understand something I should have known all along. I don't need to erase him to move on. I just need to reclaim myself. Rebuilding started small. I forced myself to create new routines. I joined a yoga class not because I loved it but because it forced me to show up somewhere that wasn't haunted by his presence. I started writing again, not about him but about me, about the girl I used to be before I became a wife, a nurse, a shadow orbiting around a man who was never mine. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, women who reminded me that there was more to life than this secret ache. For the first time in years, I let myself laugh without guilt, without feeling like joy was tied to him. My marriage became another part of the rebuilding. I didn't confess everything, some truths are too sharp, too destructive to lay bare. But I did open up about my emptiness, about how I had lost myself in the grind of work and family. My husband listened, really listened. He didn't judge, didn't push, just sat with me in the silence and held me when the tears came. And in those moments, I realized something that both comforted and humbled me. Love doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it's in the quiet, steady presence of someone who stays even when you're broken. Maybe I had been chasing the wrong kind of love all along, the intoxicating, consuming kind that burned me alive. Maybe what I really needed was the kind that gave me room to heal. There are still days when I think of him. Of course there are. 10 years of obsession doesn't disappear overnight. Sometimes I dream of him and I wake up aching. Sometimes I hear a voice that sounds like his and my chest tightens. But now, when those moments come, I don't collapse under them, I acknowledge them, I let them pass. I remind myself he wasn't my salvation, he was my mirror. And the woman I see in that mirror now is no longer broken. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll find passion again in unexpected places. Maybe I'll rebuild my marriage into something stronger, or maybe I'll rebuild myself into someone who needs no one to feel alive. What I do know is this: I survived it. 10 years of obsession, 10 years of guilt and longing and secret pain, 10 years of living in two worlds. And though I'm scarred, I'm still here. Not defined by him, not consumed by him, but shaped by what I endured and stronger for it. When I look back now, I don't just see the surgeon. I see myself. A woman who lost her way, who burned for something she couldn't have, but who finally found the strength to step out of the fire and into her own light. And that, I think, is where the real love story begins.